Okay, hello and good afternoon, or maybe morning or evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the latest WSET webinar. My name is Julia Lambeth. I'm an educator at WSET School London, and just here briefly to do the housekeeping and introduce you to David Way, who is going to be our host for this evening. So just in case you are not aware, the WSET, the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, is the world's leading provider of qualifications and courses in wines, spirits, beer and sake. So the WSET has over 50 years delivering wine and spirits and education courses, and you can now take these courses in over 1770 countries with 800 providers. So if you are interested in finding out more, please do visit the website wsetglobal.com. While we appreciate all of you being here live, if you do have to leave for any reason, this will be recorded and you'll be able to watch it on the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. We hope you're going to have lots of questions for David as we go through, so do feel free to pop those in the Q&A box as we go, and we'll cover those at the end. And in the meantime, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat and say hi, we'll appreciate that as well. So to introduce David Way. So David initially specialised in the wines of Tuscany before broadening his interests to the rest of Italy and beyond. His articles are published on his website, winefriend.org, so you can look at them there. And he works as a senior researcher for the WSET Level 4 Diploma in Wine textbook. In 2023, David published The Wines of Piemonte, which is part of the Classic Wine Library. And this provides a detailed coverage of all the 60 denominations and native grape varieties in this region, including the more famous ones like Barolo and Barbaresco, which you may have heard of. It also explores the history and state of sparkling wine production and many other things. And I can personally vouch for this as a great book to read. So the book includes over 200 producer profiles, so you can tell how much work has gone into that, and was recently awarded by the OIV in 2024 at their ceremony in Lisbon. So congratulations to David for that too. So that's my bit done. I'll hand you over to David to take you through.
Thank you very much, Julia. Yeah, it's been an amazing few years for me doing the research for this book and writing it and then making presentations like this. So I'm delighted to be able to talk to people around the world about what's new in Piemonte. And just to say a couple more things about my job at the WSET. So as Julia says, I work on the diploma textbooks. I was one of the original authors of them back in 2019. And then since then, my job has been to keep them up to date. And if I tell you that in that set of books, which run to a lot of pages, as diploma students will know, there are only 10 pages on Piemonte. So when I'd finished doing various other bits of study, I decided I wanted to write something about one Italian region, chose Piemonte, and ended up writing 400 pages about it. So you can see the difference of scale. I'm not going to try and cover all 400 pages this time, as you'll be pleased to hear. So what's new in Piemonte is the theme tonight. And I'm just going to, the first slide is simply going to run through the basics just to remind people about Piemonte. It's a well-known wine region in northwest Italy. It's famous for its red wines, so Nebbiolo, Barbera and Dolcetto. But it's also famous for tank method sparkling wine in the form of Asti and Moscato d'Asti, and also for still wines such as Gavi. Barolo, as Julia's already said, Barolo and Barbaresco are the most prestigious wines made from the Nebbiolo grape variety, and we'll be talking quite a lot about that in this session. And then finally, Barbera and Moscato Bianco are the most grown varieties. So when I ask students what's the most, grown variety in Piemonte, they all say Nebbiolo, which I understand. That's not true. It's simply the most famous. Barbera and Moscato Bianco are the most grown varieties. And then finally, on this slide, it's a conservative area in terms of winemaking. If you're looking for the sort of latest thing in orange wine or low intervention winemaking or amphora or all those things, this is really, there of course there are a few examples of that sort of thing, but it's really not what Piemonte is about. It has relied on high quality in red wines and volume sales in sparkling and white wines. That's a massive generalization, but it is a fairly conservative area which has made its mark on the world in those ways. Okay, quick overview of this webinar. What's new? First of all, Nebbiolo goes from strength to strength, the revived new regions and the new styles. And you can guess from the picture that one of the revived styles is indeed a sparkling wine. Secondly, how are Barbera and Dolcetto faring? Nebbiolo may be going from strength to strength, but what about the other two in the trinity of most famous grape varieties in Piemonte? Is Piemonte becoming a region of white wines? I've done some research since the book, and it's really interesting. And that's one of the genuinely new things which I'll be sharing in this session. Then, of course, a lot of the book is about rediscovering other native varieties, and we'll talk briefly about some of those. And then finally, the growth of traditional method sparkling wine, and that's obviously what the picture is about. Piemonte is associated with tank method, but actually there's a great story to tell about the traditional method as well. So that's basically what we're going to cover in these sessions. So we're going to move on to the first one. Nebbiolo goes from strength to strength. The first thing, an obvious thing to say, is that Barolo and Barbaresco now are firmly established as super premium wines to drink, to collect, to invest in. That's partly going back to the 1990s and the Barolo boys making Barolo famous in America. It's partly higher standards in the winery and in the vineyard. And let's be honest, it's also partly because Burgundy has become so expensive that people are looking for other investable, ageable wines to drink, and Nebbiolo fits that perfectly. Secondly, and this is really interesting, that there's a whole new category being established for Nebbiolo, and it's called Langhe DOC Nebbiolo. And this picture on this slide was taken in a very nice restaurant in Barbaresco. I'm sorry, we can't all go there right now. And you can see that the wine I was drinking was from a famous Barbaresco producer, Giuseppe Cortese, but it's not Barbaresco. It's actually Langhe Nebbiolo. So what's all that about? So Langhe DOC was created in 1994 as a new appellation, which allowed the producers to do a whole range of things. It allowed them to introduce grape varieties that are not traditionally grown in the area, like Riesling or Sauvignon Blanc. It allowed them to blend grapes from different areas. So the Langhe is the generic term for the area around Barolo and Barbaresco, but covers a much bigger area than just those two denominations. So it's been a very creative development, but actually in many ways, the most important thing about it is that it's created a second tier, a sort of second wine, as it were, from Nebbiolo from the Langhe. So as Barolo and Barbaresco have become more expensive and more sought after, there is a place in the market for a less expensive wine, but also one that you don't have to age for a long time, because Barolo classically you would keep for 5 to 10 years at least before you drank it. People just don't want to do that these days unless they're real collectors. Or for very special occasions. And you can see on this bottle that actually the wine I was drinking, and this picture was taken in 2023, was 2021. So it was a very young wine. So they've learned how to extract Nebbiolo much more softly, fewer tannins. You get all the aromatic complexity of Nebbiolo, but without the massive structure and without the need to age the wine. So Langhe Nebbiolo DOC, it has been a whole new category, which is very successfully being created and led to a lot of new planting of Nebbiolo for this style of wine, not just for Barolo and Barbaresco. Then, and this is a bit complicated, and I apologize. Well, I don't apologize for it, it just is very complicated. So they introduced a whole subzone system within Barolo. They also did it within Barbaresco, within Roero, within Gavi. These are other denominations in Piemonte. And this is part of the whole zoning scheme, which is going on apace in Italy and other parts of the world, saying, our terroir is very distinctive. We don't simply want to sell you one wine. We want to be able to show the range of types of wine which come from this one region. And the map shows one of these subzones. This is Grinzane Cavour, historic village within Barolo, and you can see that even within that there are also smaller subzones: Garetti, Gustava, Castello, Raviole, Babelino, Bozzone, and La Corte. So this was a way of dividing up and saying these grapes have to be grown within either the municipality of Grinzane as a whole, so that's one sort of MGA, or within one of these more tightly defined areas. And the grapes have to come from that vineyard. So if it says Barolo Castello on it, has to come from that small vineyard you can see at the bottom of the picture. So this has been a major, the biggest single development really since 2010 is the introduction of this whole subzone theory. So let's talk briefly about your options within Barolo. So now within Barolo, you have a range of options, and it's important to go back and to remember where we started from. So in the past, Nebbiolo was a rare grape variety. People grew a lot more Dolcetto, they grew a lot more Barbera, and they only grew Nebbiolo on the very best sites, which meant south-facing, often mid-slope, on the best terroirs, the best drained terroirs, the sunniest, the warmest places, because the climate was cooler. And basically people used to blend from the whole Barolo region, 2,200 hectares, and create the best wine they could from a number of vineyards. And it simply said Barolo DOCG on the label. That still happens. So if you look over to the left of your screen, there is something called Classico, which is exactly that, a blend of different vineyards. And a very famous producer like Bartolo Mascarello, for example, their wines, they only make one Barolo, and they've stuck to the traditional method of blending across different vineyards within the Barolo area, 100% Nebbiolo, and producing one wine. Now, the term Classico is really unhelpful in a classic Italian legal way because it has no legal standing. You will never see Classico on a bottle of Barolo because it is not a subzone as it would be elsewhere, like Chianti Classico, for example. It simply means this is how we used to make Barolo in the past from a number of different vineyards. So that's option one. And many producers will have a bottling which simply says Barolo on it, and they can blend in this way. But alongside that, they will also have subzone wines, MGA wines. What is an MGA? Menzione geografica aggiuntiva, additional geographical mention, a wonderful bit of Italian bureaucratic language. Notice it says additional geographical mention. So it has to be within a defined zone already. It has to be within a DOCG already. So you can only have an MGA within Barolo DOCG or within Gavi DOCG. And basically it means a subdivision of that DOCG. Now, in the case of Barolo, and I'm only going to do this once because the rules are slightly different in the different denominations. There are two sorts of subzone, two sorts of MGA. One can be a whole municipality. We just looked at the picture of Grinzane Cavour, and so the grapes can come from anywhere within that municipality. Or you can have one of those named subzones we saw. We looked at the Castello one or Garetti, and you can, and again, the grapes have to come from just that single subzone. They can't come from multiple subzones. Now, at this point, there can be a number of different producers within that subzone, just as there are in a Burgundian Premier Cru or Grand Cru. That's fine. However, if you have registered your vineyard name and you are within a subzone, you can also add the vineyard name, and it will typically say Vigna, vineyard, and then the name of the vineyard. So here's an example: Barolo Vigna Mondocca. So that has to come from, all the grapes have to come from that vineyard. And the strange thing, and I have never got to the bottom of this, it can only be the vineyard of one producer. It has to be a monopole. I don't understand why that is, but that is the law. Okay, so those are your two main options, either Classico, i.e. a blend, or of different vineyards, or a subzone of two sorts. However, there is also a third possibility. I'm only telling you how it is, folks. I didn't invent this system. You can also use a registered trademark. So the famous Gaia Barolo, called Barolo Spares, is a registered trademark, as you can see from the little R next to Spares. And the fruit actually does come from a single subzone, from Marenca Rivette, but Gaia chooses not to use this labeling option. And of course, Spares being a registered trademark, only Gaia can use it. So those are your three possibilities. What difference does this make to the consumer? I think it's been a genuinely good development because it means that Barolo can express a particular site, a particular vineyard, a particular subzone, not just the whole denomination. But it is complicated, and the way they implemented it was also complicated. And the biggest single difference is that Barolo being quite a large place and a lot of producers, they decided to let each individual municipality, of which there are 11 within Barolo, make their own decisions about the size of their MGAs. And surprise, surprise, they came to different decisions. So some municipalities decided on fairly small, very homogeneous subzones. So Lunga d'Alba did a very good job. Castiglione e Falletto did a good job. Others decided to have large subzones, and therefore the sense of place is somewhat weakened by that large subzone. But that's just how it is. You have to experiment to find the wines that you like, find the MGAs which really speak to you. The big advantage is that now a producer can have 3, 4, 5, perhaps even more Barolos with subtly different expression. And, you know, there's no doubt that a Barolo from the village, the municipality of La Morra, will taste differently from that of Serralunga d'Alba. So there is a real issue here because of different elevation, different aspect, where the wind blows from, the steepness of the slope, the soil type. So there are very many things which contribute to terroir in Barolo, but that's a whole other subject. So these are your Barolo options. It is complicated. There's no way of getting around that. You simply go out and find the ones that you like and enjoy the exploration. Let's move on. So the thing that I really discovered in my book was that when we think of Piemonte, we think of only Barolo and Barbaresco. We don't remember or don't know that there are a whole lot of other regions which are really interesting too. And there are revived and new Nebbiolo areas, and I'm going to cover some of these quickly. So let's go, first of all, for the slow revival of Alto Piemonte. So Alto Piemonte simply means Upper Piemonte. It's about 2 hours from Barolo or Barbaresco. It's directly under the Alps. It's not in, people tend to say it's mountain viticulture. Actually, it isn't, as you can see in the picture. But it is affected by the Alps because of the cool winds coming down from the Alps at night, which does give you very good day-night difference. And we all know that's important in terms of preserving aromatic purity and preserving acidity in grapes. So it's been a slow revival. Why was it a revival? Well, because a century ago, this was the most important area in Piemonte. It's said to be up to 45,000 hectares of vineyard in Alto Piemonte in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that's because it was near a major market of Milan. It's only now about 3/4 of an hour from Milan in a car. And in a time when transport was difficult, this was a major vineyard, much more important than Barolo or Barbaresco. But then with phylloxera, with 1 or 2 devastating frosts, and with the flight from the land, most importantly, I think, so people moved to the cities for employment, to work in factories, and the flight from the land meant that thousands of hectares were abandoned, but some have remained, and some have, you know, really come. This vineyard belongs to Travellini, which is the largest winery in Gattinara, and they are doing a great job. The big issue, and the other reason why it's a slow revival, is that apart from a Travellini, most of the wineries are tiny family wineries. I was in Navarra to taste the new vintage in the spring. I always ask people, how many hectares do you have? And many of them told me, oh, I have 1.5, I have 3, I have 4. They are tiny, tiny farms, and therefore there's no volume, and it's very difficult to market if you have such small companies. They're not all super small, but most of them are super small. But there's a real demand here for Nebbiolo and for Nebbiolo blends, which is the thing that they do that Barolo and Barbaresco don't do. So there's a slow revival going on. The big news is that Barolo and Barbaresco producers are buying wineries in the area. And Roberto Conterno of Giacomo Conterno, very famous Monforte producer in Barolo, bought the historic company of Nervi in Gattinara. Gattinara is the biggest denomination in the area. And he did something which nobody has ever done in Gattinara before, is that he built this amazing new modern winery, which you can see in the picture. If you visit other wineries, most other wineries are really tiny and very artisan and very hands-on, and that's the appeal of them. Sometimes they are literally the cellar under somebody's house. I mean, they're that small. But Conterno, being an ambitious man, built this amazing new winery. And I think as a result, we'll begin to see more wine tourism in Alto Piemonte and Gattinara in particular. He also turned the old Nervi winery into a restaurant, which I'm sure he's hoping will get the Michelin star. And so he's beginning to attract people to come to this other area of Piemonte, which people wouldn't otherwise do. And for example, Paitin, which is an important Barbaresco producer, recently bought the Cantina Bianchi in Sizzano, which is another village in Alto Piemonte. So we're beginning to see a trend whereby, and why is this happening? It's happening because it's impossible to buy land in Barolo and Barbaresco. There simply is no land to buy. Everything is planted. People are hanging on to their plots. If anything comes on the market, it attracts huge prices, up to 4 million euros per hectare. And it's just not a realistic proposition. So producers are looking for other areas which have real track record, with Nebbiolo, and Alto Piemonte is one of them. So that's the first of the new and revived areas. The second one is Carema, Little Jewel, in the pass leading from Piemonte to the Val d'Aosta. Until recently, there were just 2 producers in this village, the Cantina Sociale, so the cooperative, and Orsolani. And then it's being revived by a group of young people, basically in their 30s, who are crazy enough and committed enough to grow, to tend these vineyards on these precipitous slopes, which are where the historical vineyards of Carema were. Why were they up on these slopes? Because the plain, you're above a plain, a small plain and a river, and the various armies over the centuries have marched through that pass, going to the Val d'Aosta or the other way around, and they commandeered all the land, the fertile land, on the river side, and therefore the villagers were forced to go up to these amazing rock faces and carve out the terraces, which you can see, and put up these amazing pergolas with a very unusual system, a lot of old wood on the pergola. And the whole idea is that you have enough nutrition for the grape variety, and also you can grow your other crops underneath. That's the big advantage of a pergola in an artisan society. When food is scarce, you can use the land twice, as it were, for grapes. And for other crops. So if you ever get the chance to taste a bottle of Carema, they are fantastic wines. It's tiny, and therefore they're difficult to find. So if we move on to revived and new areas, part 3, we are getting there. First of all, Roero DOCG. So many of you will know about Roero Arnese, which is a white wine from the Roero area. Where is Roero? It is 20 minutes north of the city of Alba. So it's very close to Barolo and Barbaresco, and it's known principally for its white wine, but there has been a long tradition of growing Nebbiolo here as well. The soils are although you're only 20 miles from Barolo and Barbaresco, the soils are very different. They're sandy, so you get a very perfumed, lighter expression of Nebbiolo. So these wines are really worth looking out for. They are, I think, and I've had this discussion with the growers, sadly, I think they made a mistake when they named the wine. So they did call Roero Arnese. They put in the name of the grape variety, Arnese, within the name of the wine. So on the front of the bottle, it can say Roero and Arnese DOCG. They didn't do the same for Nebbiolo. And that was because I think they thought, well, we want to talk about Roero, we want to talk about our place, like Barolo and Barbaresco do, which after all aren't grape names, but they already have a reputation, whereas Roero continues to build its reputation. Having said all that, it does mean the wines are really good value and are really worth knowing. So Roero DOCG is worth looking out for. And then on a much bigger scale, potentially, of course, all the other areas of Piemonte said, hang on a minute, we've grown Nebbiolo for decades as well. Okay, we might have only grown a tiny amount because most of our vineyards were Barbera or Moscato or whatever, but we could grow Nebbiolo too. We could cash in on literally on the Nebbiolo boom. And so the generic regional denomination, Monferrato DOC, added a Nebbiolo category in 2020, so that in the past, if you bottled Nebbiolo in this area, large area, you had to simply call it Monferrato Rosso, red. So that didn't really help. Now from 2020, you can call it what it is, Monferrato DOC Nebbiolo. And I think we will see a lot more of this wine. In style, it's a bit like the Langhe Nebbiolo we talked about earlier, lighter expression, not intended for super long aging, ready to drink, refreshing, aromatic. Okay, let's move on. It's not just about areas, it's also about styles. What's new with Nebbiolo? Langhe Nebbiolo, we've already talked about, more accessible versions of the Nebbiolo grape variety. But there's also small amounts of rosé and sparkling, so rosato and spumante. Now, you might think this is a bit strange, but actually both Sangiovese and Nebbiolo, both tannic grape varieties, make remarkably good rosé. And why is that? It's a different style to most rosés around the world. It's dry, and it has some structure, light structure, but real structure. And of course, it has high acidity. So what you've got is a wine of medium to medium plus body with all the aromatics of Nebbiolo and a lighter structure than the red version, making a beautiful rosé which goes really well with food. It's not just an aperitif wine. The rosato is beginning to see rosato. Not very much, let's be honest, but it does exist. Similarly, there's a small amount of sparkling Nebbiolo. The Piedmontese love sparkling wines, as we'll be talking about later. But the one grape variety they didn't particularly use because it was rare and valuable was Nebbiolo. But of course, now everybody wants the sparkling wine. So some really innovative producers like Ettore Germano have produced a wine named after his wife, Rosanna. And yeah, they're really lovely wines. So those are new styles. Let's move on. If Nebbiolo is doing so well, how are Barbera and Dolcetto faring? Well, the answer on both cases, sadly, is not very well at all. So if you look at the middle of that graph, you can see that Nebbiolo has grown significantly. So this is a source of data, continuous data. So every year, there's a new set of data I've discovered since I wrote the book. I have got perfectly up-to-date data in the book, but I didn't have the continuous data. So this graph shows, and all the graphs we're going to see in the next few minutes are a comparison of 2008 and 2024. So it's very up to date. And this is the number of hectares of any grape variety in the ground in that year. So Nebbiolo has gone has increased by 2,700 hectares in just over 15 years. It's amazing. It's grown by 67%, 2/3, in just those 16 years. And at the same time, Barbera and Dolcetto have dropped significantly. So Barbera is much, much more planted than Nebbiolo. It's still the top planted grape variety, though I think it's shortly going to be overtaken by Moscato, for reasons we'll come to, but you can see it has dropped significantly. It's dropped by 4,000 hectares, over 4,000 hectares in that same period that we've been talking about. And equally, Dolcetto is basically halved in that period. So why is this going on? So if we consider Barbera, first of all, it is in long-term decline. Massively planted in the 19th century and the early parts of the 20th century for inexpensive wine. So in a period when what mattered was yield and volume, Barbera was your absolute friend. It can grow almost anywhere. It's not fussy about site. It's high yielding. And then it was pretty disease resistant. However, sadly, many of those things no longer apply. I mean, the principal reason why there's so much less Barbera is simply there is no demand for super cheap wine. Okay, so because Italy cannot compete for super cheap wine, and therefore the basic wine, which was just a food substance really for agricultural workers, is no longer required now. Wine has become a luxury item which you can buy at your discretion or not. You have to make a choice, and that really cheap Barbera no longer fits that market. But secondly, as you can see in the rather sad picture, Barbera is particularly susceptible to a disease called flavescenza dorata, flavescence dorée in French, vine yellows in English. And you can see, I mean, this is a real tragedy. The vine appears to be fine. It puts on leaves, it grows fruit, and then suddenly it just dies off and stops growing. And you can see, and this is quite late in the season, you can see that the grapes have not ripened properly. You've still got, it's like the middle of summer, veraison, well, late summer, whereas actually all those grapes ought to be purple. So flavescenza is a real problem for Barbera. It's difficult to combat. There's no cure. You have to try to prevent the vector, the insect which carries it. That's difficult. And growers have just got to factor in that they're going to lose 5%, up to 5% of their vineyard every year, and replace those vines. So disease is a real problem. But it's not all bad news for Barbera, because the counter side is that the quality has risen dramatically. Lots of Barbera on the market at very reasonable prices, which are really delicious, drinkable wines. Always has high acidity, always has loads of fruit, very immediate, beautiful wines to drink. And then there's a top tier of really top producers, Michele Chialo, Braida, many others producing amazing wines of real substance, which will age for decades because of that acidity, if you wanted to. But you can drink them early. They don't have the tannins of Nebbiolo. So the Barbera story is very mixed. Sadly, the same can't be said of Dolcetto. What are Dolcetto? The figures here are simply the decline in the number of hectares planted between 2008 and 2024. And you can see it's pretty much a straight line of decline over those 16 years. Why is that? Well, although Dolcetto is grown over much of Piemonte, there was an awful lot in the Langhe, so in Barolo and Barbaresco and the immediately surrounding area. And of course, Dolcetto's biggest problem in life is that it's not Nebbiolo. There's huge demand for Nebbiolo, so surprise, surprise, what the producers have done is consistently remove Dolcetto from the vineyard and replant Nebbiolo, either for Barolo and Barbaresco if the site is warm enough and you're within the denomination, or for Langhe, DOC, Nebbiolo, as we were talking about earlier. So climate change has undoubtedly contributed here, because whereas Nebbiolo was difficult to ripen in the past, that's no longer the case. Much warmer climate, drought is now more of a problem. than the lack of heat, plenty of heat. So you can replant your Dolcetto with Nebbiolo pretty easily and, get double your money basically. And, let's be realistic. Wine growers are going to do that. So that's one problem. The second problem is that it has a poor reputation. And a bit like Barbera, there was an awful lot of really basic Dolcetto for which there is no longer a market. I think this is extremely harsh because if you choose even a mid-price bottle of Dolcetto from a decent producer, you will be rewarded with an amazing wine which has, powerful floral notes, red cherry, fantastic, decent acidity and tannins. It has structure, it has everything that you want in a glass of red wine to go with food. So I think its reputation is partly just historic, but it can't get away from it. People think of it. The name doesn't help either because people think it's going to be sweet, which it isn't. So yeah, it's a real problem. And then finally, there is a huge marketing challenge. It's twofold. One is that because so much Dolcetto was grown in the Langhe, of course, all the marketing effort has gone into Nebbiolo. And therefore, Dolcetto has sort of come third in the, in the race for the marketing budget, which is never a good place to be. And then there are just so many Dolcetto, specialist Dolcetto denominations, so Doliani, Ovada, Dolcetto d'Alba, etc., etc. And there has been no overarching body. There's no promotional body for Dolcetto as a whole. Italians are very good at many things. Collaborating across, complex terroirs where they haven't really had historic relationships is not really one of them. So there's an opportunity here for a marketing genius to get those denominations to work together in order to promote Dolcetto. Okay. Slight change of tone now. And again, this is the research I've been doing really recently. And raising up this fascinating topic, is Piemonte becoming a region of white wines? Now, if we just stand back for a moment, I didn't show you on a slide, but if you look at the black varieties overall in that period of 2008 to 2024, there has been a reduction of 16% overall, despite the growth of Nebbiolo, and it's largely due to the drop in the amount of Barbera, and we rehearsed all the reasons for that earlier. The interesting thing is that at the same time, there has been a significant growth in white grape varieties grown in Piemonte. It's grown 14% in the same period. And that's without taking Moscato into account because the Moscato plantings are exactly where they were 16 years ago. They have changed hardly at all. It's all the other things going on around Moscato that has made the difference. Now, to be absolutely clear, the bar chart is the increase in hectares in those years, not the total numbers, okay? So if we had a bar chart with the Moscato on it, you would barely see these grapes because Moscato is Moscato is 4 times the amount of Cortese, for example, and about 10 times the amount of Arnese, okay? But if you just look at the growth, which is what the chart shows, Arnese has been the biggest winner, up by, 570 hectares. Timorasso is a store all on its own, up by 400 hectares. Chardonnay's done well. Cortese is doing okay. And then you've got a whole range of both international varieties and local varieties have all done well in the last 15 years or so. So by volume, Arnese, Timorasso, and Chardonnay have become really important. Is Piemonte becoming a region of white wines? Well, the dial has certainly moved, okay? So that, yes, it is still predominantly black varieties in Piemonte, but white varieties are on the increase. And now it's just a 60-40 split. So the 60% of the hectares are black grapes and 40% are white. And that's a significant difference even from 16 years ago. So it's quite clear that there is a demand, that the producers are planting more white grape varieties, and that there's a real demand for those grape varieties. And we'll talk about Timorasso and Nascetta in particular in a moment. Okay, so let's move on to the next big topic. Time is running out. So yeah, rediscovering other native grape varieties. Nascetta and Timorasso are two white wines of distinction from the area, which are really worth looking for. Nascetta, medium-bodied, subtly perfumed grape variety with a capacity to age. So those two glasses are, one is a young Nascetta, one is a 8-year-old Nascetta with a real capacity to age. Timorasso is a real star variety and has gone from 40 hectares to 400 hectares in no time at all. And the real proof of its being impressive is that many famous Barolo and Barbaresco producers have planted Timorasso in the Colli Tortonesi, which is more than an hour and a half's drive away. So it's not convenient, but they are so impressed with the grape that they have done that. And this produces a much more full-bodied, more structured grape variety that is at its best after at least 4 years in the bottle. So it's perfectly pleasant when it's young, but it improves dramatically in the bottle and puts on all those hydrocarbon notes that you associate with Riesling, aged Riesling. So it's really interesting to age Timorasso. Equally, I love both Grignolino and Ruchè, and in a way they are contrasting pair, just like the Nascetta and the Timorasso. Grignolino is medium-bodied, aromatic, mildly tannic, and can be chilled. So, it's a lighter wine by Piemontese style, but with lovely structure all the time. Ruchè, I love to call wine on steroids. It's just big in every dimension. It's intensely aromatic. It leaps out of the glass at you. It's high alcohol. It's commonly 15% and above. It's acidic and it's high tannins. It has absolutely everything. But despite sounding like a bit of a monster, when I've shown it to people, they've absolutely loved it. It really is an impressive grape variety. So much of the book is about rediscovering native grape varieties, and there's so much to talk about there, and so much for us all to discover. Okay, let's move on to the growth of traditional method sparkling wine, and then we can have some questions. So Piemonte is known for the tank method, and in the book I argue the case that the tank method is the ideal method for aromatic varieties. We all tend to think that traditional method made in a bottle is the best because it's like champagne and it has, aromatic complexity because of that. But actually, if you start with an aromatic grape variety, the tank method is perfect because what you get is the grape variety in your glass. And when I was doing the research for this book, I'd put on this tasting of 12 different wines from a range of different grape varieties, Moscato, of course, but also Bracchetto. There are no fewer than 3 Piedmontese Malvasias, which are all aromatic. Barbera can be made in this style, and so on and so forth. And they all express the primary aromatics of the grape variety, and they're really interesting. There's a great story here, and yeah, they're lovely wines to explore. There is also, however, an amazing story of traditional method, and that is, in a sentence, that Piemonte was the pioneering region in Italy for traditional method wines made on the Champagne model in Italy. So long before Franciacorta or Trento DOC, there was a tradition of making traditional method sparkling wine in Piemonte. And it was started by a guy called Carlo Gancia. There's a very famous company called Gancia. And he, as a 19-year-old, took himself off to Champagne and spent 18 months learning how to make traditional method sparkling wine, came back to Piemonte, set up his company, and began to do experiments. Now, he immediately had a problem, of course. That is, there was no Pinot Noir or Chardonnay to make his sparkling wine with. So he did experiments with Moscato, which doesn't work particularly well because Moscato is a fully aromatic grape variety. But then at about 1870, he discovered a source of Pinot Noir in Italy, in the next door region, in fact. And so he began to make traditional method from Pinot Noir in Alto Piemonte, sorry, in Piemonte. And then there was a gap. Tank method became the thing. The sparkling wine houses, were very successful with tank method. But then about 1990, they said, do you know what? This was our original tradition here. We shouldn't allow the other regions of Italy to be the ones that are famous for sparkling wine in the traditional method. We should do this ourselves. So they set up a research project. They planted clones of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. They did micro vinifications. And it all led, in the end, to a new denomination called Alta Langa, the Upper Langa, which was to be a traditional method sparkling wine made from a minimum of 90% Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, and which had to be made in the bottle. So they did two things right. They said, first of all, these things should be planted at altitude. And as the climate has got warmer, the growers are growing their vines higher and higher. So we're now 500 meters, 550 meters, 600 meters for the cooling effect of the climate for these grapes. The other thing which they did, which was really good, was that it set a very high standard for time on the lees. So the rules say that you have to age it on the lees for 30 months, 30 months, which is way longer than Cava, Champagne, Franciacorta, any other denomination you care to name. So that every bottle of Alta Langa will have marked, biscuity, toasty, or autolytic notes, in the bottle because of that rule. That was a great idea. And then the last thing to say on this slide is that there's also a tradition of making traditional method with local grape varieties. Erbaluce di Calusa, as you can see in the slide. Erbaluce is a grape variety, high in acid, neutral grape variety, perfect for traditional method because it really shows off those toasty notes. So the picture shows a lovely bottle of Erbaluce di Calusa, and then also a Reserva from Coppo for their Alta Langa, which, as I've said, is principally Pinot Noir. So yeah, there's a great tradition in Piemonte of growing traditional method sparkling wine. So folks, thank you so much for your attention. Here's the book in its full glory, published by the Académie du Vin Library just over a year ago. And it takes you on a journey of exploration through these amazing regions and subregions and the lovely complexity of Italian wine, but frankly, it's worth it for the pleasure it gives you in the glass. Over to you, Julia.
Hi again, David. Thank you so much for that. What a great overview of all the things that are happening, and hopefully a nice little insight for people about some of the information they can get in your book as well. We have had some questions come in already, and I'm sure we'll get a few more now that people have a chance to think through. So I'm just going to try and pick out a few to start with, and we do have some similar themes here. First couple in respect to climate change, which you did mention a little bit at the end there, but more to do with the red wines. So we've got one that has asked, is climate change a factor in the revival of Alto Piemonte? And another that's asking more about Barolo, what can winemakers do there with the challenges of climate change that they're experiencing?
Yeah, thank you. Good questions. So Alto Piemonte, I think, I don't think the climate's made a huge difference, except that the Nebbiolo is regularly ripe in a way that it never was in the past. The nice thing about Alto Piemonte is the alcohol levels are more restrained, so that they're still regularly making wine, which is 13.5% alcohol, occasional 14, occasional 13. I think it's wonderful to have that style. So I think it's all been a benefit thus far from them, apart from, of course, catastrophic rain, all the other things that come, hail, all the other things that come with climate change. Barolo is more of a challenge, and there is a real debate going on as to whether the historic south-facing sites are any longer the best sites because they are so super hot. And the problem about the steep slopes, which have also been a real bonus, is a problem because if you have what the Italians like to call a bomba d'acqua, a bomb of rain, a bomb of water falling on your vineyard, steep vineyards, the problems of erosion are a real problem. What can people do about it? The most important thing is really careful canopy management, leaving rather more leaves on the vine. It's really difficult balance because you have to guess what the rest of the season is going to be like, how much shade you leave over the grapes and for how long, because obviously you want them to ripen in the end, but you want them to be protected from, super, like 2022 was a hot and dry year. The producers who did best protected their grapes better. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Obviously a topic that's on the minds for pretty much every region, but
Yeah.
good to kind of understand what's going on there. Just another question here about Alto Piemonte, actually. The question asks, do you believe Alto Piemonte has a chance to regain recognition and interest in the global wine market despite its historical fragmentation, or do you think some form of aggregation would be necessary?
I would love there to be a simple Alto Piemonte DOC. I mean, that would be on my dream. That's my dream for Alto Piemonte. It's not going to happen because, individual villages would have to sort of vote to go, to stop using their own names. So they're going to have to do it via the much more long-term thing about getting producers known, about getting the style known, about competing on price, because typically the wines are cheaper than Barolo and Barbaresco. So there are lots of good things they can do. There is an overarching body which looks, which has the interests of all the, and does the marketing for all the producers. So that's really good. But it is a struggle. There are only 500 hectares of vineyard. That's a quarter of the size of Barolo. And there are 10 denominations. I mean, the one thing that they love creating denominations back in the 1970s. Sadly, there are just too many of them, but that's just how it is. And therefore, the overarching body is really the one that's going to help them market those wines. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. And then just sticking with red wines, with Nebbiolo for a second, a couple of questions about the Langhe Nebbiolo that you mentioned. So someone has asked, is it aged? If so, how long and what type of barriques? And someone's asked a more kind of broad question, is Langhe DOC more comparable to an IGT wine? So maybe just a bit of clarification there.
Sure. So on the first question, they very cleverly, and I don't know whether this was deliberate or not, they made no stipulation about how it was going to be aged. Okay, so whereas with Barolo, it has to be in wood for X months. Ditto with Barbaresco, they said, the wine can be released relatively young, and it's up to you, basically, how you age it. That turned out to be an absolute masterstroke because it also contributes to the style. Because if you keep your wine in stainless steel or even in very neutral large barrel for a year, let's say, you are going to preserve so much more of the immediate fruitiness of Nebbiolo, which is just a fantastically aromatic and beautiful grape variety. So that's a real plus, and you don't get the complexity of Barolo and Barbaresco. You don't get the development of tertiary character, all those things. So you have actually, in effect, created a different wine from your same grape variety. So that was a really good. So yeah, there's no requirement to age it for long, and typically people age it either in stainless steel or in very large barrels of neutral old oak, and therefore have minimal effect on the wine. What was the second question?
The second question was more, is it kind of the Langhe DOC comparable to an IGT classification?
Yeah. Okay. So the other interesting thing, an unusual thing about Piemonte is that it doesn't have an IGT at all. So everything has to either be DOC or DOCG, or simply wine, vino. So there's nothing in between those two. Is it like an IGT? No, not really, because actually the Langhe, okay, yes and no. The Langhe is a relatively well-defined area, and therefore it's not like an IGT which covers a vast region at all. They did do something which has not helped. I talked already about the issue about Roero. They didn't really help because they included Roero within Langhe DOC. So that was good in terms of if you suddenly want to grow Riesling in Roero, you've got a home for it, but it's not very good because it means that the profile of Roero is yet further diminished. A lot of people make Langhe DOC from Roero fruit, but Roero gets no credit for it because it just says Langhe DOC. So in that sense, it's a little bit like an IGT, but no, fundamentally, it is a well-defined area of southern Piemonte around Barolo and Barbaresco and the neighboring areas.
Cool. That is very clear. Thank you very much. A few people have got in some questions about some other grapes, so maybe we can address some of those. Simple one, just can you tell us about Nizza Barbera?
With pleasure. So I said that that the good news for Barbera is there are really high quality wines, and Nizza DOCG, NIZZA, is a DOCG of a relatively recent creation, which was carved out of Barbera d'Asti. So it is the same. It's the historic heartland of Barbera within the much bigger Barbera d'Asti denomination. It has much stricter rules. It has longer aging requirement. And it has quite a powerful marketing machine, which is really great because these are wines that, people won't know there is a town called Nizza Monferrato. They have to learn that Nizza is somewhere in Piemonte. It takes time. So this is really a denomination aiming and succeeding in creating high quality Barbera wines to compete in a world market. And famous producers like Michele Chialo, who we mentioned before, have made significant use of the Nizza category. My only criticism of it would be that, as so often happens in new wine areas, that people have a tendency to over oak their wines. It happens in so many places. People say, "Oh, I'm gonna produce something that's gonna be on the market at $50 or £30 or whatever it is. So I'm gonna throw everything at it." And we're just getting to that phase. I think it was launched in 2014, a decade later. We're just beginning to get to the phase where people are saying, "Do you know what? We can actually reduce the oak and still get the glorious expression of the Barbera grape variety."
Yeah, interesting. I've certainly had some of those really big oaky styles, which do have their place, but I think you're spot on for kind of acknowledging that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Another great variety mentioned here, Dolcetto. We have a fan of Dolcetto, but as you said, people get thrown off by the name, thinking it's sweet. So what's the best way we can tackle that misconception? Is there a way?
I think the only way is to get it into a glass in front of a customer or a friend or your own table, and just try these wines out, because they are. It is. I have done my best. I'm going to bat for Dolcetto, and I had a wonderful meeting with a woman who is now actually the president of the Growers Association. And I said to her, "You are up in Dogliani, which is high Alto Langhe territory, and you are surrounded by people planting Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, for Alto Langhe, as we discussed earlier. But and she said, but I am planting Dolcetto because this is Dolcetto region, and her father was a partisan in the war, so he fought against the Nazis in the war. And he said, I am going to be a partisan for Dolcetto." So I applaud her, and I think the main thing, as I've said, is to get it into people's, get people to taste it, to drink it, to understand the quality you're getting nowadays with really good vinification and really clever work in the vineyard to get high quality wines at reasonable price. Yeah.
All right. I think we can all work on that. Just one more question. I think we'll try and squeeze in then before we sign off. And I'm going to end on this one because it's actually one you've helped me with already. And it's just a question about wine tourism. How accessible is wine tourism in Piemonte?
Right. Yeah, great topic. So undoubtedly the center for wine tourism is the city of Alba. And Alba is only about an hour and a quarter by car from Turin Airport. Okay. Now, Turin is not a major hub. You know, if you're going to fly from the States, you're probably going to have to go to Milan. But even that is only an hour and 3/4 away from Alba, or an hour and a half. So yes, and there is now a very significant infrastructure for wine tourists in Piemonte. I mean, the best thing of all are the restaurants, as I hope you experienced when you were there. I mean, wow, the food is absolutely amazing. They love their wine. They're very knowledgeable. They have great stocks of wines, you know, in mid-tier restaurants, in high-end restaurants. So there's a lot of infrastructure now. There is the accommodation side is not quite as well developed. There are more and more fancy boutique hotels. There are a couple of the average hotels in Alba. There's you know, Airbnb, all that sort of stuff. You have to do a little bit of work really to find somewhere to stay. But yeah, there's so much opportunity. And I mean, the other thing to say about it, which I haven't said, it's just one of the most beautiful vineyard landscapes in the world. So you know, it really is worth it. And then the very last thing to say is, of course, you know, like the book, that you have to at least get out of Alba at least on one day of your wine tourism. You have to go and visit Nizza or a Moscato producer or somebody other than a Barolo and Barbaresco producer. Great though those are, because you want to get a little bit of experience of the wider things that Piemonte offers.
Brilliant. Well, that sounds like a great note to end on. Sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't quite get to. But thank you everyone for watching. If you haven't noticed, there's just been a little feedback poll which has popped up, if you could complete that before you leave. And just as a reminder, the session is recorded. The recording will be emailed to everyone, as well as being available to watch on the Events Hub on YouTube. And as before, if you want to learn any more about the WSET qualifications, please go and visit wsetglobal.com. And so to finish with, I will just echoing all of you in your messages in saying thank you so much to David. It has been a fantastic presentation. I think we've all learned a lot, and probably more importantly, all kind of fancy a glass of Piemontese wine now. So I think off we'll go and do that.
Thanks very much, Julia. And thanks to everybody who's listened. It's great to be able to speak about these things. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks and see you next time. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.